Hello. This discussion of the security dilemma specifically looks at Robert Jervis's 1979 influential article on the topic. We will be looking at the prisoner's dilemma, the security dilemma, how anarchy and cooperation are influenced and produced by these effects, as well as offense-defense balance. When we think through this particular article, why are we reading it? We're reading it because it has implications for today. We're also reading it because it's a foundational piece of international relations and an excellent piece of scholarship. I thoroughly enjoy the historical component and extensive use of evidence in support of the argument. I say that because don't get lost in the history. So there are times where there are paragraphs, sometimes pages, of historical defense of a particular point. That is an important thing to read and consider, as will be said in other components of this class. If you want to study political science, or society, or economics, or sociology, you have to have an understanding of the history behind the events and behind the positions. As much as possible, the more you have, the better your view and multiple views can be taken. Having said that, this class is about critical thinking, is about your ability to take material and apply it. Not how well you study a particular article's history. So don't get lost in the history. What you need to be able to do in my classes is articulate an argument based on the reading and the lecture and the debates and the engagement. And sometimes you do need to have a historical example or something else to support it, but not at the depth of just trying to memorize Jervis's article. So let's quickly discuss prisoner's dilemma. Remember that you have to have rank-ordered preferences. And what that means is that an individual actor, whether in the international system or modeled in between or amongst different economic approaches, models, actors have a rank order. And what that means is you do care about certain outcomes, and then you give them a preference, or you give them an order. It's pretty straightforward. The example I typically use here is pizza toppings. What's your rank order of pizza toppings? What's at the bottom? What's at the top? Those will influence how well you can cooperate with someone whose rank order preference of pizza toppings is different than yours. What the prisoner's dilemma does is it gives us an understanding of the international system and why there might be this incentive to defect that grows from anarchy. So what is the prisoner's dilemma? There's two actors. They may or may not have committed a crime. There's not enough evidence to convict them. And so in the dramatic version or dramatized version of it, you separate them you interrogate them, hoping one will crack. And there's a preference order in this, and that is that you hope that if you don't want to be the person who cooperates, aka you stay silent, and the other person defects. So what's the top outcome? You would defect, and the other person would cooperate. This is turning state's evidence. This is literally what happens in some cases, where you would say, I want a lighter sentence if I help you convict this other person of a deeper sentence. So you get up with less punishment, the other person gets more. That's the most preferred outcome. Next is that you both cooperate. You both stay quiet. Okay? You really trust that person, they can stay quiet. Next is that you both defect, because at least you're both going to jail together. The worst case is that you cooperate, you stay silent, the other person turns you in or gives up state's evidence. You get the longer sentence. Well, what ends up happening in this simultaneous single-shot game, so we're only playing this once, right? We're not doing repeated or other kinds of influences, just this one shot, is the Nash equilibrium, because both players have an incentive to defect, the Nash equilibrium, the outcome of that game is that both people say what happened, trying to get their best preference, and they both end up going to jail. Right? On the slides that are posted, not these, but that Dilbert link takes you to Dilbert. It's a cartoon. I think that the 3 minutes is worth, or 2 minutes, explicitly establishes the prisoner's dilemma parameters and how it's executed. If we take a more formal approach to it than that video, here you'll see player A1 and A2, row and column. What this shows you is that while cooperation, where you both are off with a lighter sentence, what ends up happening is this Nash equilibrium here, denoted by the asterisk, is that if you're presented with a situation where you could cooperate or defect, you have an incentive to defect. How to look at that? We can compare, if you look at row player, so player 1A, and you look at these first numbers, 3 or 4. So should you cooperate or should you defect, given the behavior of the other player? So in this case, A2 is going to cooperate. You don't know that, but they might do it. Well, if that person cooperates, doesn't really, in this column, which one's larger, 3 or 4? Well, 4. So you defect. So in the case where the other person cooperates, you defect. In the case where that person, you think they're going to defect, if you cooperate, you get 1. If you defect, you get 2. That produces an incentive for you to defect. And you can do it the same way with column player. 3 or 4, which one's larger? 4. 1 or 2, which one's larger? 2. That's how you end up with defection. That's also why anarchy in the international system requires other mechanisms and institutions and opportunities for cooperation to occur. It's extremely simple, but extraordinarily powerful, right? Not simplistic, but simple. But what about people? Do people behave this way? Okay, but do people behave this way? Well, thankfully for us, the British have some of the best game shows out there. Okay? And so they'll take an American game show and make it better. So if you ever watched Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, like the first 5 questions in that really old show, which I didn't really watch, but it's funny how different they are. The first one is like, what color is the average fire hydrant in the United States? Red, right? The first question on the British game show was like, who was the 3rd Archduke of Yorkshire? What? What are we even talking about? Well, the British do that, and then they apply it to kind of, brutal games. One of them is Golden Balls. Now, my favorite clip for showing the prisoner's dilemma is no longer available because of copyright, but if you just Google Golden Balls on YouTube, you'll see a lot of these scenarios that are built on the prisoner dilemma. People have opportunity to win a bunch of money, whether they cooperate or whether they split the money. If they both cooperate, they get this to split the money. If one steals and the other cooperates, the one who stole gets all of it. If they both split or if they both defect, then neither one of them gets the money. What's fascinating about this show is that there's all kinds of communication and other ways that the prisoner's dilemma is augmented, depicted in the show. So what does the cooperation problem, does the prisoner's dilemma help us solve or show us? Well, first it's the incentive to defect. Next is that strong institutions can prevent defections or limit them at least. There are other canonical games on cooperation, but Prisoner's Dilemma is the most widely cited, and it's one that you need to be at least somewhat familiar with. So what does that mean for Jervis in his article? Well, he establishes, and he goes through each of those scenarios, each of the 4 outcome sets, cooperate, defect, those, and establishes how those apply to the international system. And you need to be able to kind of generally articulate each one of those. Well, he argues that there are a couple of things that arise from the prisoner's dilemma that we should be aware of. One is what would now be termed called the shadow of the future, which is an incentive to defect given above must be added to the potent fear that even if the other state now supports the status quo, it may become dissatisfied in the future. What that means is the incentive to defect is not a single shot. It doesn't just happen once. As you move into the future and things change, there might be an additional incentive to defect. So while you might cooperate now, you may not in the future. That makes cooperation more difficult. Next is that, and this is somewhat dated, it's very land-based in this article, if a state's not self-sufficient, they may seek it. In anarchy, that may result in conquest. Now, I would argue, and he would too, this is an old article, well, I don't know what he would argue, but exceptional scholar, so I'm sure he's updated, is that geographic possession of land may not be as important as it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even 30 years ago, right? What are the mechanisms of state power? You still need land, you still need resources, but I'm not sure it's the same relationship. Okay. The other thing that this produces from the prisoner's dilemma is the security dilemma. Many of the means by which a state tries to increase its security decreases the security of others. That's on page 169. Another way to say that is the results of one state pursuing security increases may cause a reaction in another state that ultimately decreases that first state's security. Right? This is called the spiral model in international relations. That unlike in domestic situations where you can unilaterally improve your security situation, you can't do that in the international system, right? Because if you do something, someone else may respond to it. So this is, I identify the UK argument and policy with Japan on the size of navies, just to highlight kind of the historical nature of the argument and why it's important, or how Jarvis, I've watched a lot of Marvel, how Jervis articulates the general point is that the UK needs a strong navy now, and Japan should be able to build their own. But what happens if Japan, also an island nation, wants to consistently increase its navy or naval capacity? What does that do to the United Kingdom, and vice versa? Right, so these are two states that have similar security profiles that may destabilize each other, even though they're trying to improve their own defense. So how do we read some of the sections? So this has walked you through up until page 172. The next are all of the profiles on the outcome sets for prisoner's dilemma. What I want you to be able to do is kind of scan this, pull out some of the key insights, one of which is costs matter. So if the cost of military arms is low, you, depending on if you're the status quo power or not, will change your behavior as a state. So that there's influences that affect state behavior based on if they're status quo or not. And that's very helpful when we think about tying this article to next week's reading on the Too Good model of foreign policy, which specifically is thinking about status quo powers and the status quo of some kind of issue space. Okay, so think about ways to connect this article with others. And I also think that has huge implications for the current world. Next section of the paper examines areas that are important: geography, commitments, belief, and security through expansion. Page 183. What you need to be able to do is define each one of these. So define geography. He talks about mountains and rivers, and one of the most important features of the United States are the Atlantic and the Pacific. All right? The fact that there are enormous oceans, especially the Pacific, separating the United States from other powers is hugely influential. Right? So the United States has enjoyed geographic advantages by having friendly neighbors to the north and south, and stable neighbors to the north and south, and no one on the east or west. Right? If you go to Europe, you go to Africa, you go to South America, you go to Asia, that's not the case. Other countries have to deal with other states at different types of security preferences because of geography. He talks about commitments, and he talks about beliefs. Jervis has one of the most important books in international relations, and a whole subfield on the importance of political psychology and leader memories and psychology in decision making, and how bias makes decisions, or not makes, but influences decisions. What I want us to note is that he explicitly talks about leaders' memories and kind of what historians might call living memory that shapes policy outcomes. So again, when we think about the Too Good model of foreign policy, and a question that I want you to wrestle with is the role of history in shaping current events. Jervis is one of all many scholars who took that question head on to identify that says, yeah, we have to have a starting place for how we engage different topics. All right, the final section of the paper that we look at, and one that I want to spend a little bit more time on, is offense, defense, and the security dilemma. And so what is the security dilemma? He restates that on page 186. An increase in one state's security decreases the security of others. It's also summary. I want you to look at the summary on page 193 for offense and defense, what this means in terms of a military context. And so what does it mean? Well, what he's looking at here is offense or defensive weapons, military capability. Military capabilities can be used to defend or for expansion or for offense. And depending on who has the advantage, whether it's offense or whether it's defense, and if you can differentiate them, will influence the world events. Okay, so when we think about defense having the advantage, security, improving your own security is less dangerous to other states. Right? So we have to think about the cost of offense or defensive weapons or capabilities. When offense has the advantage, securing self exacerbates the security dilemma, because think about it, you're buying offensive or buying capabilities that may threaten others. Okay, so just look through that. There are two organizing questions for determining the outcome of offense versus defense. The first is whether defense or offense has the advantage. Okay, so is it more beneficial for a state to do defense or offense? Next is defensive weapons. Can they be distinguished from offensive weapons? Okay, so I think for me, because I study defense, this is my career area. Sometimes I go through this too fast. And I was about to skip that and just say, oh, you should get it. But we'll walk through it, and you need to make sure you read through it. Jervis outlines that technology and geography frequently influence defense or offense advantage. Historically, this has been true. Historically, geography has been as much more influential, arguably, in determining which is more beneficial than technology. Now, I would argue technology has surpassed geography in many cases. In great power politics, so those powerful states, the United States, China, Russia, maybe the European Union, if you count it, maybe if you count them as one, states that can project power, right, or have nuclear deterrent capability, then we can expand the club of states who are in that. Technology is the defining capability. Okay, so read through it, recognize it is 1979, so there's been a lot of updates in the last 40 years, but it's still an important consideration. The next is arguably the more important question. Can you distinguish between offense or defense balance? Defense is as potent as offense. The status quo power can cooperate. You can obtain advanced notice of threats. There's arm agreements banning offensive weapons, and that's because you can improve your own defensive capabilities without threatening other states. But if it cannot be distinguished, that produces a different kind of outcome. Do read through his section on strategic nuclear war. It's completely applicable as it was when it was first written. And the reason why we need to think about this is, what are the four worlds? Because there's two options. You can identify offense, defense, posture. Can you differentiate? And then does offense or defense have the advantage? So there's four possible outcomes on two axes. This is on page 211 of the article. Think about the importance of the outcomes. Which world would you want to live in or conduct policy in? And which world do we actually operate in? Right. These are hugely important questions, because depending on not you or me, political leaders' view of where they fall in that matrix may determine how they spend money, may determine how they use military force, certainly determines foreign policy objectives. So pay attention to that overall figure. To conclude, make sure you have a sense of what security dilemma is, what anarchy is, and cooperation, how those three interact. Review the prisoner's dilemma. I'm not going to ever ask in this class, this is super basic, you can do this now, but we're not solving game theoretic models in any kind of context. That's just there so that you can see the logic behind incentives to defect. And then I want you to think about the state of the world as it relates to that offense-defense posture and differentiating between offense and defense. Thanks.